Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our March Virtual Speaker Series presentation, Who Lived Here, with guest speaker Richard Collins. My name is Ben Weiss. We are the Historical Society of Ottawa, and Karen Lynn, Sherry, and I will be your hosts tonight. Before we begin, please join me in acknowledging whose land it is upon which we gather tonight. Okay. For thousands of years before colonial times, the members of Indigenous communities traveled from far and wide to gather at the meeting of the three rivers, the Ottawa, the Gatineau, and the Rideau, from the Chaudière Falls to the mouth of the Gatineau River. This area is rich in natural resources, plants, animals, and fish, and also provided a convenient meeting place for trade and communication among communities. Of special significance are the burial place at Hull Landing in the Chaudière Falls, a sacred place for meeting and sharing in ceremonies. The burial grounds in the Ottawa-Gatineau corridor, including Hull Landing, were important for rituals of respect and bonding with the landscape. Victoria Island, located under the Portage Bridge, continues to provide the sacred space to local and visiting Indigenous people. The National Capital Region, which includes the City of Ottawa, remains unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. We encourage our members and guests to reflect on this, our connected history, and ways we can contribute to reconciliation. Next, please let me extend our thanks to the City of Ottawa, the Province of Ontario, and to our members. Without your continued support, none of what we do would be possible. If you are not yet a member of the Historical Society of Ottawa, we invite you to consider joining in order to support our work, our speaker series, our social media presence, our publications, our awards for students, and more. If you think you might be interested, please visit our website or check out the link that I'll ask Sherry to post on our chat box. At the Historical Society of Ottawa, we've been telling Ottawa's great stories for a century and a quarter and more, including now through this twice-monthly speaker series. As you know, we currently run two separate parallel speaker series. We bring our virtual presentations into the comfort of your home, as we are tonight on the second Wednesday of each month. In addition, we invite you to join us for our in-person presentations in the Ottawa Public Library Main Branch Auditorium on the fourth Saturday afternoon of every month. You can join us next at the auditorium at 1:00 p.m. on Saturday, March 23rd for James Powell's presentation, Ottawa's Women on Ice. James Powell, author of our beloved Today in Ottawa's History blog, will take us back to the 1940s and early 50s and the dazzling young woman who was the pride of Ottawa, Olympic figure skating champion and Canada's sweetheart, Barbara Ann Scott. And James will talk about Ottawa's first provincial women's hockey champions from over a century ago, the Ottawa Alerts. Plus, James will take us even farther back to a famous photograph taken at Rideau Hall, the first known photo of women playing ice hockey, featuring none other than Isabel Stanley, daughter of Canada's hockey-loving Governor-General, Lord Stanley. We return with our Zoom series at 7 p.m. on Wednesday, April 10th, with guest speaker David C. Martin and his presentation on the first golden age of Jewish life in Ottawa. Joining us that evening and introducing David will be Anna Bilski, the great-granddaughter of Moses Bilski, the founder of Ottawa's Jewish community. We finish our season back at the auditorium on Saturday, April 27th to hear the story of legendary photographers Malik and Yusuf Karsh, featuring guest speaker Paul Couvret, a renowned photographer himself, who is a friend and colleague of the famous Karsh brothers. Also in April, we are presenting our third lecture series at the Sunnyside branch of the Ottawa Public Library, featuring Phil Jenkins. Phil's three-part lecture series will be held on 3 consecutive Saturday afternoons beginning April the 6th. Spaces are limited, so visit our website and sign up right away if you don't want to miss out. As our spring speaker series winds down at the end of April, watch out for details on an exciting summer of special event programming. Keep an eye on our website, Facebook page, and Instagram for details on planned events such as a bus excursion to Kitigan-Zibi on June 1st to the annual powwow there, museum club events, and opportunities to participate in Chief Panesi Day on July 1st. And now to tonight's presentation. Before I introduce Richard, a reminder to everyone to kindly keep your settings on mute so as not to interfere with our speaker's presentation, and turning off your video feed once we get going. That assists with our overall transmission as well. Tonight's presentation will be followed by a Q&A session. So during the presentation, please start typing your great questions into the chat box. It is my pleasure to introduce my friend Richard Collins this evening. Richard has been active in the historical community, not only here in Ottawa, but also back home where he lives now, in a place near Toronto most of us have probably never heard of. What's it called, Richard? Mississauga?
Mississauga, yeah.
Okay, okay, I'll have to remember that one. Richard has been a
Well,
valued
you can
member
pronounce
of
it, but can you spell it?
Richard has been a valued member of the Historical Society of Ottawa since 2018 and is the hardworking editor of Capital Chronicle, our quarterly newsletter. Richard also assists with our pamphlet series, including authoring our recent pamphlet, Ottawa Mobilized, in which Richard documents the history of existing buildings and locations in Ottawa that were key to our city's preparedness during times of war. Following a similar approach in tonight's presentation, Who Lived Here, Richard promises to take us for a virtual tour of the homes that remain today to remind us of some of the most influential figures of Ottawa's past. Richard, we're ready for our tour.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you everyone for inviting me. I'm excited to be here. As Ben has said, I still am a member of the Historical Society of Ottawa, and I did live in Ottawa for 3 years while I was caring for my mom. I ended up moving back to where I am in Mississauga, so maybe now that I mentioned that, I will, since Ben has mentioned our acknowledgement of the Algonquins, maybe while I'm here, since I'm doing my presentation from Mississauga, I will acknowledge that I am on the traditional treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And I really miss my time in Ottawa. As you can look at my cover page here, I love walking around the streets of Ottawa, taking photographs of buildings, partly because I love architecture, but I think architecture is a great monument for telling us about people from the past. So when you look at a building, I'm one of those people that says, I love the architecture of that building, but I also wonder who lived there and what contribution did they make to Ottawa, whether they're rich people that live in magnificent homes or oftentimes people that live in smaller homes. Just curious about the people that lived in places. And oftentimes when they tear down buildings, they'll put up a monument in its place or a memorial plaque. And I always feel that the memorial plaque doesn't really tell you as much as the building itself. It's so much more important to save some of these lovely buildings because they do tell us so much about the past and about the people that have made Ottawa what it is. So what I'm doing tonight is going to take you on a stroll along some of the walking tours that I've done in the past, and we're going to stop at some of the buildings and talk about the people that lived in them. I've got lots of them here, so I'm not going to go into too much detail on each of them. Some of these people I could talk about for hours on their own, but we'll stick mostly with the buildings themselves and just briefly about the people in them. And I want to start with this one. This is a very ugly building. And on top of that, it's a building in Mississauga where I live. So why would I start a show on Ottawa's great architecture with a really, really ugly building in Mississauga? And you'll find out in a moment why I picked this building to start with. This building belonged for a long time to a couple by the name of Stanley and Anna Krizak. I don't know if you know who they are, and it's probably a good thing that you don't know who Stanley and Anna Krizak are. I'm sure the Royal Canadian Mounted Police would be pleased to know that you've never heard of these people because they kept these people in hiding. And if there's no better place to go in hiding than Mississauga, in this old house that's set well back into the road, so you can't really see it from Mississauga Road. Stanley Krizak died in 1982. And he was buried at Spring Creek Cemetery in Clarkson here in Mississauga. And then in 2001, his wife, Anna, passed away, and she was laid to rest alongside her husband, at which point they removed the tombstone that's Stanley Krizak and replaced it with a new tombstone that reads Igor and Svetlana Guzenko. So some of you may now recognize that name. This is where we shipped from Mississauga back to Ottawa. Igor and Svetlana lived in Ottawa in this building on Somerset Street West. Igor got to Ottawa in 1942 when the Soviet Union opened up an embassy, and he became the cipher clerk. We're still at war with Nazi Germany in 1942, so Soviet Union is considered our ally. So they come here as one of the first countries to have an embassy, and we treat them very much like they're a friendly nation. I want to mention that because, of course, our relationship with the Soviet Union changed in years to come, as Sir Winston Churchill warned us in advance. But you have to remember, we pictured them as coming here as allies, and they were one of the first people to set up an embassy. Now, Mr. Guzenko was a cipher clerk, which means even though they were here as our friends, nonetheless, messages that came in from Moscow were sent in code. And what Igor's job was to translate this gibberish into Russian so that diplomats at the Soviet embassy could understand what was going on. And this went on fine for about 3 years until he found out just before the end of the war. In fact, the war in Europe had ended, but we were still fighting. The war in Japan hadn't ended yet. That Igor and his boss were going to be sent back to the Soviet Union earlier than suspected. And Mr. Guzenko got a little bit suspicious because usually if you get recalled back to Russia before your 5-year term is up, usually they're assuming they're going to send you on a nice vacation to Siberia somewhere. And so one day when he was translating some information, he began to realize that there were spies in Canada, Russian spies. Now you might think, well, that's kind of naive. Of course there are spies in Canada. Of course there are spies in the US. And almost certainly we had spies in Russia too. But it has to be understood at the time, Russia was our ally, so we didn't really expect it. So Igor had very sensitive secrets. So one night he decided that he wasn't going to return home to his apartment, unit number 4 in this building. I don't know which unit is number 4. But I do know it's this building. There are plaques across the street at Dundonald Park. Fortunately, there's a nice park across the street where you can read the plaques that talk about Igor and what he did. But essentially, he turned, or rather, he went to the RCMP that night with the documents that showed that there were spies in Canada. And so he was taken into protection. The family was moved out of the building immediately so that people that might want to take Igor out for defecting to Canada. He ended up for 3 years in a camp called Camp X near Oshawa. And then finally in 1948, they found him the home that he lived in for the next 40 years or 35 years or so in Mississauga under an assumed name. This is not the building he worked in. This is the building that's on the same property now. This is the modern day Russian embassy. When I was doing walking tours one day, I referred to it as the Soviet embassy. I tend to have a habit when I do my walking tours of talking about buildings by what they originally were, by their original name, and was built as the Embassy Union of the Soviet Socialist Republic, but it is the Embassy of Russia now. However, this building burned down in 1959 when Guzenko was working for the Russian embassy. He was working in this building here, which was originally built for John Frederick Booth, the second eldest son of the lumber merchant Gerberth. We'll talk more about this later. I just wanted to show this picture to show you. This is the building where he walked down those front steps one day and took his secret information to the RCMP and thus changed his life. You might remember, some of you, if you remember Front Page Challenge, you can raise your hand via Zoom if you remember Front Page Challenge. He was a very frequent guest on that show, and he would always show up with that bag on his head. So no one really knew what he looked like. We all found it later. That photograph right there is from his KGB file when he was still a good guy to the Russians. And so that's kind of my connection between Mississauga and Ottawa. From there, we're going to move and talk about some of the lumber merchants. And I'm going to start with the lumber merchants because I want to start with this building right here, which kind of relates to our previous story. This is a magnificent building that was originally built for Andrew Fleck. We'll talk about him in a moment. But I'm going to start with the second owner, who was Norman McLeod Patterson, because he was a senator that lived in the building in the years after the Soviet embassy was built. And I have it on good authority, that coming from the late Francois Brega in one of his tours of Sandy Hill, that the senator, being a very proud Canadian, allowed the RCMP to use his garage at the back because his garage farther back lies adjacent to what is the Russian embassy now. So I guess that RCMP spies could listen in on what the Russians were doing. But before that, it was his lovely home in a very unusual, almost kind of a, I don't know how you describe it, almost a Richardsonian style. There was an architect, American architect by the name of H.H. Richardson, who loved to use heavy stones and a very kind of a brooding pattern. But just a great building. I've been inside this building because now it's the Algerian embassy. And during a doors open a couple of years before COVID, I had the opportunity to tour inside this building during doors open, and the Algerian embassy really puts on a wonderful display. Not only get to see the inside of a great building, but you also get to see a lot of Algerian heritage. It's both the Algerian ambassador's office and residence, and it's also the embassy itself. But it was built for this gentleman, Andrew Walker Fleck, back in 1902. And he was an iron merchant. His father had started something called Vulcan Iron Works, had a factory on LeBreton Flats. But later on, as you can see, he married. You can see his wife's name there. He married into the Booth family. The Booths, we'll talk about later, were a very prominent lumber family. And as we go through this, you're going to find a lot of lumber merchants in Ottawa. You have to keep in mind that we think of Ottawa now as our nation's capital. It's where all our politicians are running around all over the place. But even for about another generation after Ottawa became the capital, the dominant employer in the capital was still all the lumber companies. There were dozens of them. And at one point, almost half of Canada's lumber was being processed in mills in Ottawa. That has since shifted out to BC. But we have to remember, we were very much a lumber town. And so we're going to go through some of these. Here's another lovely house on Bronson Avenue that's now owned by the Anglican Church, but was built for Ward Campbell, who was the son of John Ward Hewson, who started one of the earliest lumber mills and then later merged with the Gilmores, other noted lumber merchants. And there's a building you see off to the side in Gatineau, across the river where their head office was. So they too were also lumber merchants at the time. Ward Campbell himself was a lumber merchant, but he ended up enlisting with the Royal Canadian Engineers. He was studying engineering, and was sent over with the RCE, and he was involved in the Normandy invasions, but unfortunately, early on into that invasion at Falaise Gap, he was killed in action. And so you can see 1936. He moved out of this building, but he died in 1944 at about the time that the lumber trade was moving out of Ottawa anyways. But a fantastic building that still stands. This is one of my favorite buildings, a very curious building. William Henry McAuliffe is not one of the more notable lumber merchants. In fact, he eventually became more of a lumber retailer because he couldn't compete with the bigger merchants that had thousands and thousands of acres of forest land in the Ottawa Valley, the Madawaska River region. So you can see the photograph off to the right is in LeBreton Flats, which is where his lumber yard was, but it was more of a retail yard too. But I love this building. It's designated under the Ontario Heritage Act. And it's quite curious because it's a symmetrical building. Usually symmetrical buildings are very easy on the eyes because the symmetry makes them easy to look at. But this one seems quite cluttered despite its symmetry. And I think that's why it got designated. On the bottom floor, the main floor, you see two apartments. McAuliffe lived in one of them, and wisely, he rented the other one out so that he could actually make money off his property, living in 182 while renting out 184. But then you see on the second floor, the 2 units breaks into 4 bay windows, which so it goes from 2 to 4. Then all of a sudden on the top, you have this odd third stage where you have the 3 dormers. So you go from a 2 to a 4 to a 3 stage. And then there's even the 2 smaller dormers, which kind of add 5 stages. So it makes kind of a wonderful, your eye bounces around all over the place with this building. But it's still quite an architectural treasure. And I'm glad to see that in the early 1990s, this building received heritage protection under the Ontario Heritage Act. And it's all commercial businesses now. So yeah, as you're walking around, we're going into Sandy Hill now, and you might stop and think of some of these buildings that look quite lovely, and you wonder who lived in them. And in this case, yet again, another lumber merchant. The Frasers were prominent lumber merchants as well. And this is the son, Henry Alexander, Henry A., whose father, Highland Hugh Fraser, they called him. They called him Highland Hugh because he had most of his lumber lots in the highlands outside of the Ottawa Valley, most of them in Quebec. But again, the more lumber woodlots that you own, the more production that you could put into business. But perhaps more notable in this one, even though it is owned by a lumber merchant, but we'll move on to this guy, who you might recognize this gentleman's face. During the Second World War, from about 1940 to 1947, oops, let's go back, I'm jumping ahead here, sorry about that. This was the home of Billy Bishop, who we tend to think of as a World War I flying ace, and he certainly was, decorated many times. But during the Second World War, he was called to Ottawa to lead the RARCAF in what was called the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, which was to get people from all over the Commonwealth to come to Canada to learn to train as pilots. They didn't want to train them in the UK because the UK was in range of the Luftwaffe. And so that, let's move everyone to Canada. And airports all over Canada, from Newfoundland to British Columbia, even up into the Yukon, were all converted to training thousands of pilots, not only from the Commonwealth, but then later on, as places like Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands and Belgium were occupied by the Nazis, they moved their legitimate governments to London, and they moved their legitimate air forces to Ottawa, where more men could be trained. And so they left the great Billy Bishop in charge of that. So he lived here for 7 years before moving to Montreal after that. So yes, our famous World I flying race lived there on Blackburn Avenue. Again, while we're on the lumber merchants, this is the big daddy for me. And I love this guy because he was in my neighborhood. I lived only about a block and a half away from this house when I lived in Ottawa. So I love to tell people that the richest man in Ottawa was my neighbor. John Woodolphus Booth got into the business very early, 1854, and he just was a small businessman, small lumber merchant, until around the 1870s, when there was a fairly deep recession in Canada and in Ottawa. A lot of lumber businesses went out of business, and so he bought a huge number of woodlot of acreage on the cheap from other businesses that were going out. So at one point, he had what was well over 500,000 acres of woodlot in the Ottawa Valley, which made him a huge producer of lumber. At one point, his lumber mills dominated LeBreton Flats and part of Victoria Island. Later on, he moved a pulp and paper mill in 1904 onto Victoria Island. You can still see a couple of those buildings on Victoria Island now that are from his pulp and paper days. So just a very powerful man. He spent most of his money building 2 railways, so that not only did he control the lumber market, but he was able to control the cost to ship his lumber from place to place. So if you're ever driving along the Queensway today, Highway 417, you can thank J.R. Booth for that, because he built his railway, the Canadian Atlantic Railway, from Ottawa to Parry Sound. And that railway was moved out in the 60s when Jacques Grébert, one of my enemies, because he destroyed a lot of heritage, including that railway line to put in the highway. So you can thank him next time on the 417. That was the alignment of the Canada Atlantic Railway, which took his lumber to Georgian Bay and then on ships from there into Western Canada. Died in 1925, left it with his son, and then since 1947, it's been Laurentian University, just a kind of an alumni hall for them. It's another building. In years past, I've seen inside that for doors open. So keep a look at your calendar for this year. It might be open again. Wonderful interiors, because what he did when he invited guests over for parties at his house, he was usually inviting affluent business people that could be his customers. And so he hired the finest customers using his wood to make the most elaborate carpentry skills for the interiors. And so when you go inside there, you just see some beautiful carpentry work. A very elegant house, although not a huge house, typically of the Scottish heritage. It's a nice elaborate house, but it's not one of the bigger mansions that you'll see in Ottawa. And there's Charles, that's his son that took over. And he's the guy that kind of closed the business down as Ottawa started to fade away as the center of lumber once British Columbia started to take over as the main source of lumber. And he ended up investing most of the Booth money into real estate. A couple of buildings, actually a couple of blocks of buildings on Bank Street were all developed by the Booths. The older building belongs to James Skeed, who was a very early lumber merchant at the time. First started in 1842 and one of the first to harvest wood from the Ottawa Valley. But he too got out of the business when it got too competitive and turned most of his farmland into Westboro, into all the various communities. If you live in Westboro now, chances are you live on land that belonged to James Skeed. He started to develop Westboro in the early 1900s. Later on, after he moved out, 1887 and 1910, it belonged to a gentleman by the name of George Clark Holland. And he's an interesting fella because he started out as a printer for the federal government and then got into publishing, was a part-time owner of the Ottawa Citizen, and heard of a new advanced type of computer, essentially an early version of an electric typewriter, which he invested heavily in and converted the Citizen's typewriters all over these newfangled machines, and then invested in the company which was owned by the Edison Company, not necessarily Thomas Edison himself, but by the company that Thomas Edison had formed. And then through that, he also got involved in filmmaking because the Thomas Edison Company at around the same time was making the very early kinescope film cameras. And so he invested in that company and started to bring some of the earliest films to Ottawa in the actually in the late 1890s. There was a park along Holland Avenue, incidentally named after the family, after George Clark Holland. It was a park at the end of the streetcar line, and they would hold some of the earliest movies ever broadcast in Ontario, thanks to George Clark Holland and his investment in this camera company. And I also have a picture of his lovely wife here because she invested most of her husband's money in charitable affairs at the time. She volunteered with the poor, raising funds to find work for the unemployed. And eventually this property was sold, it was transferred for $1. I'm pronouncing this right, to the Source de la Visitation, which was a French convent, but it was also became a boarding house. You can see towards the back when it was expanded for homeless women at the time. So a very important early fundraiser. We're going to meet a few more ladies in Ottawa's history that love to spend their husband's money, but they spent it wisely in making Ottawa a better community. Peter Allen, as one of the very early lumber merchants. His house still stands on Richmond Road. Kind of an interesting character. I don't have a picture of him, so I showed some picture of these people here that were sometimes called shiners. They were the hardworking lumbermen that worked all through the winter, but when it got too hot to harvest wood in the winter and the woodlot just became infested with mosquitoes, these men had nothing to do through most of the summer, so they would come into Bytown and early Ottawa and get drunk and pick fights. And there are a couple of cases where the shiners essentially became Peter Allen's thugs. He would threaten politicians that he didn't like. Unfortunately, all this is true because the Allen family admits to that. Later in 1848, he moved to Gatineau and became a justice of the peace, which is an odd thing for a man who had committed a number of crimes, none of which he was ever convicted for. So he is a community builder because he did bring a lot of employment into Ottawa, but also was kind of the reason that Ottawa got its first police department because someone needed to keep a check on Mr. Allen. And you can see a lovely stone house. You can definitely obviously tell the earlier stone houses because they were made of stone. Later, brick and wood became a popular. Same with this one. Another early lumber family, Thomas Cole, built this lovely home further down on Richmond Road, a little bit closer to Britannia. Again, not a big lumber merchant himself. He eventually sold it to larger people of the McLarens and the Camerons, who yet again were also lumber merchants. And it's most noted for his son, Lloyd Bailey Rochester, son-in-law actually, who married his daughter Lucy. And when he acquired the house, when he inherited the house, he built the lovely gardens, Maple Lawn Gardens, which are still there today. They're owned by the National Capital Commission, so they're open to the public. So if you really want to appreciate Lloyd Bailey Rochester's contributions to Ottawa, I invite you to take a trip down to Richmond Road, and you can see at the right there, lovely gardens that are all open to the public. And that was his pride and joy. He actually hired one of the noted landscape architects of the time, in Oliver in 1935 to do the landscape gardening work for this building. And we'll end off as far as the lumber merchants goes with this man who, again, wasn't one of the more prominent lumber merchants, but he became famous for this house. If you don't recognize the man, you probably recognize the house. He built this house in 1868 and named it something I very doubt I can pronounce properly. If you have any Welsh or in me, you can swear at me now because I'm going to attempt to pronounce it as Northwistra. It's Gaelic for place of rest, but we know it better as 24 Sussex Drive because he didn't give the house to the National Capital Commission. During the 1940s, the National Capital Commission began expropriating as many properties as they could along Sussex Drive, where this house is, which is why when you drive along Sussex now, you see mostly government buildings. You don't see a lot of private residents. So they wanted to expropriate Swirsa, I'll call it 24 Sussex from this point forward, from a later person. It was George Cameron Edwards, who later purchased the house, and he was the one that took the NCC to court and says, you're not expropriating this property. And he finally made an arrangement to have the house transferred to the NCC, but only after he died, which he did in 1947. And then it became the property of the NCC. And then 3 years later became the home of most of our prime ministers. I'm not too sure if Justin is there at the moment or not. I hadn't updated. And in between was his grandfather, the man who purchased the property from Courier, and one of the dominant lumber merchants. You can see from this map. I couldn't find a photograph of him, but I thought this map told his story better. That's Green Island, where the former Third City Hall was. And to the left of that, you can see a lot of land that's now owned by the NCC, which is all parkland. But this was the lumber yards and the mills of W.C. Edwards, one of the largest lumber companies after J.R. Booth went out of business. And you can see they completely dominated this part of the Rideau River and used the original mills that were built by the McKay family, by Thomas McKay, for power. But eventually, some of the NCC wanted to clear all the industries out of that area to make it part of Confederation Road. And so these buildings were all taken down through the 40s at the time. So from lumber merchants, we'll take a look at some of our industrialists here. Let me grab my watch. Keep an eye on my time. Sorry about that. I just realized I can't see my watch, so I want to make sure I don't go too long here. One of my favorite houses, this is quite a distinct house. You can't mistake from anything else on Metcalfe, oftentimes known as Burkett's Castle, because it looks very much like a Norman castle. But it was the home of a man who started out as a lumber merchant, but realized there was so much competition by this time. He eventually went into the hardware business and opened up a large hardware store and office complex, which still stands designated, again, as is this building, at 115 Rideau Street. Again, this building, for many years now, it belonged to the Boy Scouts for a long time, and I believe now is still the residence of the Hungarian ambassador and is also the Hungarian embassy as well. But a magnificent building, also a building that in the past has been open for doors open. So keep a look at your schedule this year and see if it's open, because again, it's another beautiful building inside, and we have Thomas Burkett to thank for that. He was also mayor for 1 year, and he was the person that encouraged another person in the moment to bring electricity into Ottawa. So he allowed a franchise to allow electric lighting, and one of the first streets to get electric lighting was Metcalfe Street. So this house was one of the first to have electric lighting in it. Another industrialist from this time period is a number of plants, so to speak. One became a mayor, but this was Herbert Alfred Plant, who became president of a brokerage firm. What he did originally was invest in mining ventures, and through mining ventures, he realized it was more lucrative actually just to invest in a number of other people's mining ventures, again, gold, copper, all sorts of things in Northern Ontario. So he made most of his wealth as a brokerage. And here, instead of a picture, I thought I'd show you an article of his wedding. You can see it's a large article. Nowadays, you don't see the kind of articles, even when you cover the royal weddings, they don't get this kind of detail. But weddings back in this period, when the really rich business people got married, you got all sorts of details of what the bride wore, the beautiful gowns, all the guests that came. It was really the kind of stuff that you love to read in the newspaper, or see what the rich people were doing at the time. It's interesting to note that Ottawa has a lot of really nice buildings that belong to industrialists. But I found when I was living in Ottawa that there's not as many as you'll get in most others, because Ottawa is very much a politics town. And I know you're going to be frustrated when I say that, but usually politicians are not the richest people in the world. I know they get good pensions and they make good money, but they don't make the kind of money that factory owners and mining investors and bankers and brokers did. So usually the biggest houses that you'll find in Ottawa, the ones that are the most elaborate, tend to belong that people were involved in businesses. Like this gentleman here, not so much an elaborate house, but I love it because it's one of the oldest houses that still stands in Ottawa. And it originally belonged to the Fuller family, for which the street is named. But by this time, I'm talking about it because of George Cecil Morrison, who made his money in bread, one of the largest bakeries in Ottawa. was formed by George Cecil Morrison, who went into business in 1914 with a partner, Richard Lamoth, and they opened up a bread factory in 1914, a building that still stands, that also has heritage protection. And he expanded over the years, finally expanded into a very large building. His bakery was so large by the 1960s that it had a big building out in Alta Vista area, but unfortunately, he died soon after that, or actually the partner, Richard Lamoth, died soon after that. And I guess they had overextended themselves and they closed their big bakery a year later in 1966. And then that building was eventually taken over by the Museum of Science and Technology. So when you go to that building again, the oldest building on that site, believe it or not, started out as a large bakery, belonged to the Morrison and Lamoth families. Another gentleman, again, with a lovely home. This one designed by Vernon Noffke. We're going to talk about him in a minute when we get to see some of our architects. Lovely home on Rolla. Had a printing business, and most cities had printing businesses. People usually did fairly well, but in particular, in a city as bureaucratic as Ottawa, where pretty much everything that happens in Parliament gets printed and published and filed, Ottawa was the place to be a printer. It was never a Queen's printer. He never printed official documents, but was often contracted to print lesser documents for the government, things that didn't necessarily go on file, but things that were published for public consumption by the federal government. And so, yeah, the Rolla Printing Company became a very dominant business. At one point, it was employing over 400 people. And this one, very, very important person in Ottawa's history, and one of the more prominent buildings today. Warren Soper Young was not an American, so don't be confused by the photograph. This is the photograph I took a few years ago, and all the decorations wrote because I was there to attend an event on July 4th, because this is now the residence of the U.S. ambassador to Canada. It's been that since the 1930s, but it was originally the home of Warren Soper Young, who someone you do need to know about, because if you ever take an OC Transpo bus or a streetcar, or if you flick your light on to get some power, you've got this man to thank. He started out with the Dominion Telegraph Company as a kid, and he loved to tinker around with the phones. He actually got in trouble once for tinkering around with phones, and he approved the phone dialing system. And the bosses said, hey, wait a minute, this doesn't work with the rest of our system. But they agreed it was a much better system, and he issued a patent for it and eventually became fascinated with all things electrical, devising a system for heating streetcars. In the winter, obviously it gets very cold in Ottawa in the winter. One of the problems with traveling in the winter is that streetcars were very cold. And so he ended up forming his own company, which made electrical equipment for the Ottawa Car Company that started building streetcars, and then eventually became the owner of the one of the owners of the Ottawa Electric Railway, which is today's OC Transpo. He was also a land developer, so a lot of his money came from that, because he bought a lot of land in Westboro and had the advantage of having the streetcar line that he could build out into that direction, so that it was easy for him to sell lots, because he could sell lots close to the streetcar line. Which gave him an advantage because it was a way for people to get out to his properties. And so that's one of our more gentleman-looking people too. It looks like a kindly old uncle there. And a magnificent building if you get down there, because sometimes the U.S. Embassy does hold events that you can see Mr. Soper's lovely home, which he called Lornado. Not exactly too sure how it's pronounced. But apparently I go with Lornado because apparently it was based on a novel about someone by the name of Lorna Doone. And that I don't even like the book, and that's how we got the name Lornado at the time for the building. So from industrialists to retailers, Charles Ogilvie, some of you probably remember shopping at Ogilvie's. He had a large store, which is located now where the Rideau Center is. Most of that building has gone over the exterior of his original 1906 building is still standing. But I particularly like this house very much in the Frank Lloyd Wright style. Ottawa doesn't have a lot of buildings in the style of the long, low, horizontal. You can see strong emphasis on horizontal lines with windows that have a very strong verticality to them. So you get this very blocky feeling that was very popular, what's called the prairie style. A lot of homes in Chicago where Frank Lloyd Wright worked. Now, he didn't design this building, but it's very much in that style. And it's just a great building. It's not designated. It's not even protected, so it could get torn down. So keep your eye on it. But Yeah, Ogilvy was a prominent retailer and also a strong supporter, very much a nationalist during the First and Second World War. At one point, he allowed all his workers to sign up for duty both in the First and Second World Wars. And on top of that, it assured them that whenever the war was over, when you come back, your old job will be available to you. And he also supplied some funds to Canada's two regiments that were at the time, the Governor General's Foot Guard and the Cameron Highlanders of Ottawa. He gave them money for equipment that they could use, especially during the First World War. So a prominent nationalist, as was this man, Archibald Jacob Freeman, originally from Lithuania, of Jewish heritage, but when he came to Canada, he became, excuse me, a very proud, excuse me, take some water here. A very proud Canadian. He opened Freeman's across the street from Ogilvy, where Hudson Bay Company still is today, in a building that he had built around 1913, I believe it was. And yeah, again, he also supported the war, became the head of the Victory Loan Committee during the First World War, and then also became part of the War Relief Society of Canada during the Second War, which provided homes in Canada for people that lost their homes in the Third Reich, in Nazi Germany, people that had lost their homes during the German invasions of countries like Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia at the time, and a lot of people from Lithuania, which lost their independence during the First World War to the Russians. So that frustrated him very much. And so, yeah, again, like his partner across the street, the great thing is you had the two competitors side by side, and you think that would normally be bad business because you got a competitor right across the street. But it turned out having the two side by side was very good for business, because when you had two businesses together, that encouraged more people to shop in the downtown core. You weren't just going to one retailer. You had options, very much like in New York, where both Macy's and Gimbel were famous. You never see one department store that's famous on its own. It's usually two department stores in competition that encourage people. Let's go down to Manhattan to shop at Macy's or Gimbel's. Or certainly in Toronto, there was great competition between Eaton's and Simpson's. And so the same thing in Ottawa. The Freemans and the Ogilvies were very much in competition to get the shopping dollars of the people. And I want to talk about this lady. I think, Ben, you mentioned her earlier in some context, because I recognize the name Bilski. This was Jacob's wife. There is a plaque to her in front of their home here on Somerset Street West. So you can read about her, but essentially someone who very much was involved in social activities during the First World War. She formed the original Poppy campaign in Ottawa, where she actually ordered 20 or 30 sewing machines, conveniently from her husband, which she installed in this building, so that after the First World War, I should say, she hired women to make poppies, which were then distributed in order to raise funds for the veterans that were coming home to Canada but had lost their jobs. Again, her husband was someone who allowed their workers to come back to their jobs after the war. But a lot of people, when they left the railways or wherever they were working before the war, didn't get their jobs back. And so she was very much involved, like her husband, in finding work for veterans that returned after the war. And that's really how the Poppy campaign began. We recognize it now more to honor those that died in battle, certainly a worthy cause. But originally, for Lillian Bilski, Lillian Diamond, she was originally did it to help the veterans find work back here in Canada, and became involved with the Jewish War Orphans Committee of Canada during the Second World War, raising thousands of dollars to bring Jewish war orphans to Canada. Again, mostly Jews that Israel itself wasn't a nation during the First World War, but of course people in Germany that were being sent to a concentration camp, so just generally were left homeless. And she found money to bring a lot of people of Jewish heritage to Canada. Yeah, so a worthy plaque for her in front of the building that since the 1947, I believe, has been the Canadian Army Officers' Mess, but a beautiful building in Centertown. But before that, it was originally built for Gordon Pate. I'm going to move on to another picture because that's the best picture I could find of this guy. It really makes him look awful. But Gordon Pate was in business with this man, William Goodhue Purley. Purley and Pate was one of the largest of the original lumber merchants that developed most of Le Breton Flats and the Chaudière Falls as their source of power for their lumber mills. And so he had this house built in 1891, and then it later on, 1913, was purchased by the Freimans or Freemans. Well, talking about important people, Jewish heritage in Canada, another retailer, Bertram Loeb, rather modest home, but that was typical of the Loebs. Bertram is the guy there. It looks like he might be the father in this photo with his two sons, but in fact, I just had to crop it for size, but it's from a larger photograph of 6 people, of which they're all brothers. He just happened to be the eldest brother, which is why he looks so much taller. The 6 brothers got together and built just a small local grocery store in Lower Town, but they found it early on in the 50s. This is about the time that a lot of the original supermarkets, so to call that, a term that wasn't used till the 50s, oftentimes we use today, when bigger companies like Loblaws and Dominion were building larger stores and encouraging people to come to their stores because they had national chains. They had buying power that these smaller independent grocers didn't have. And so what Bertram and his brothers decided to do was to form an alliance of smaller businesses, smaller grocers that wanted to stay independent, but if they all grouped together to have more buying power, if 30 or 40 stores could all buy together, they could still compete with the bigger supermarket companies like Loblaws, Dominion. I'm trying to think of some of the others, Safeway, I guess, further west in Canada. And so this independent grocers alliance, so to speak, eventually did form of a chain its own, which became the Independent Grocers Alliance, or some of you might remember IGA, as what eventually became known as. So Bertram, and who was the eldest, was the founder of what eventually became IGA. Another one of the earliest retailers were the Bates family. Now, I just have a picture of Hermione Bate, who lived in this house, because it's one of my favorite buildings. I really love the architecture of this building. But there's about 4 or 5 buildings that belong to the Bates family, all along Wilbrod, about 7 or 8 of them. And there's also one close to where I lived, which is now the Syrian embassy. But as far as I can tell, it was abandoned pretty much all the time I was in Ottawa. Hermione's father was Sir Henry Newell Bate, who opened up a grocery store, but very early realized that he could do a better job being a wholesaler for other grocers. Again, very much like the Loebs did 100 years later. He was someone who decided, rather than have my own grocery store, I will wholesale. So I will buy groceries and sell them to other local grocers in Ottawa. So there was never really a Bates chain of retailers, but he was someone who was helped a lot of local retailers, a lot of grocers survive. And if you're interested in hearing more, again, because I'm trying to keep these bios short, if you go to our Bytown pamphlet series, most of them are online, there is a 3-part series on the Bates family and of the 3 generations of grocers in Ottawa. And as you can see how successful grocery wholesaling was, because you can tell by the lovely buildings. This building also, if you look to the 2nd floor there, you can see alongside some lovely terracotta artwork, which is really great, where you take bricks and you melt the clay into molds. So when it hardens into bricks, it hardens into these lovely shapes that you can see alongside the tall windows. One of the nicer buildings in Ottawa, though not designated. How are we doing on time here? I don't want to go too much longer. I want to be about just a few more minutes here. So I will talk about some of our mayors, but very quickly, because I could do whole articles just on the individual mayors and what they've done. But again, just to show you some of the buildings that are still standing. Now the Abbotsford House, which is a seniors residence, but belonged to the mayor of Ottawa from 1875 to 1881, Charles Herbert McIntosh, who's the man who brought running water and fire suppression system into Ottawa during his term. And then, but was originally owned by the Muchmore family, who were just early settlers that developed a lot of their property south and west of what is now Lansdowne Park into that neighborhood. And a central school in that area was named after the Muchmore family in 1895. Grenville William Goodwin was only mayor for about 8 months before he died in office. So not a big contributor to Ottawa's history, but I really like this home. So I'm showing it mostly for that reason, because as I was riding my bike along the Clemel neighborhood, a lot of great homes in this neighborhood, but this one has a really nice kind of a Tudor revival style to it. And it was also later owned by Colonel Charles Petch, who was a commander, originally commanded, if I got this right, the North Nova Scotia Highlanders during the Normandy invasion in World War II. And after the successful invasion, he was reassigned to Italy, to the other side where the Allies were moving north, where he was given command of the Princess Louise Dragoon Guards, which was one of the 4 Ottawa regiments that fought from the Ottawa area during the Second World War. So when he retired, he continued to command the PLDG in peacetime. And then another plant, as we talked about before, a great home in a very unusual style. It's hard to kind of pinpoint what architectural style this is, but that's one reason why I like it so much. But this belonged to Frank Henry Plant, who was mayor in the 1920s, 1921 to 1923. And then after another mayor had died in office in 1930, he took over the rest of his term. And if you recognize the plant back, and often wonder why that means that, it means that it was named after him because he commissioned 2 indoor swimming places for people at a time when there was no place for people to swim. So yeah, one last mayor I want to talk about before I kind of draw this to a close. I do want to finish with a couple other women here. Notably this lady, I'm sure you've all heard of her, Charlotte Whitten. And this is the home that she and her partner lived in, Margaret Greer, for 30 years in Rockwood. I won't say much again about her. I'm sure you know lots about her, but she was our mayor for a long time. Now, what I'm doing is, because I'm starting to lose time here, and I don't want to go too much longer, I'm going to move ahead. I'm just going to show you some buildings very quickly. I just love this building because it was owned by 4 people that were not local politicians, but were all either fathers of Confederation or premiers of provinces. Some wonderful educators. Again, maybe in the future I can do more of these. I thought I'd just show you that one quickly. Sanford Fleming, the father of Standard Time, amongst other things, who lived in this house on Dowley Avenue, which is designated as part of that whole Heritage Conservation District. Again, sorry, I want to move through some of these quite quickly because I've got a long show for you here. And we can get to some of these. Elkanah Billings was an early paleontologist. I passed through some of our early scientists here, but I thought I'd mention this one because the Billings were a very important part of early Ottawa history. But Elkanah was the first one not to be a farmer in Billingsbridge. He became an early paleontologist and was an amateur paleontologist, really. He just, as a young kid, he loved to dig up bones, and he kept going over to the Geological Survey of Canada, which was located in the Victoria Memorial Museum building. And I guess he pestered him enough until the man in charge of that institution brought him on as a paleontologist. And the man who was in charge at the time was, I forget his first name now, his last name was Logan, William Logan, Sir William Logan. The highest point in Canada is Mount Logan, named after the first man who was a director of the Geological Survey of Canada and an Ottawa resident. I'm going to skip our doctors. I'm going to go past some of our hockey players. Sorry about that, because I want to keep our time brief. Some people you'll recognize, of course. There's Lorne Green. Can talk about him in the future. And because in my introduction, I did promise you a Ghostbuster, I thought I'd show you this place because it's one of the most wonderful buildings. 1875, Philomene Terrace. It is 8 units, all built by someone who ran a quarry. And so you can see that's why it's all made of stone. But 2 notable people that lived here. In one of the units, the far unit at 363, was Archibald Lampman. We talked recently about him, and we had a presentation about his wife being one of the first women to work on Parliament Hill, Maud Lampman. But Archibald himself was a poet who was famous mostly because originally he loved to write about nature, but he was also writing at the time of Confederation and became a very passionate person about talking about how great Canada is as a land, and became one of the so-called Confederation poets who wrote a lot of poetry that really just praised Canada, and also Ontario, but eventually became an unofficial poet laureate. And yeah, just the earlier picture I wanted to show you of Peter and Lorraine Ackroyd. When I was doing my research, I found out Peter would work for the Royal Navy in Ottawa as an administrator. And at one point in between 1968 and 1973, when you go through the old phone books, his son Daniel had his own phone number. And that, of course, is Dan Aykroyd. A couple other people, painters. I'm sorry, I'm going to pass through a lot of these. I do want to show you some of our architects here just quickly. We had a recent pamphlet about the and presentation about the Maycourt Club, and this was the building that the Maycourt Club was in after it was lived in by the architect, John Albert Ewart, and there's one of his buildings familiar to us all. Werner Nofty, I could love to do an entire slideshow on the magnificent buildings this man lived in. But here's the house that he did live in the Clemau district, and then a second home that he lived in up in the top left, and just some of the great buildings that if you'll invite me back in the future, I can talk of some of these wonderful buildings here. And again, I'm just going to move past our engineers here. I'll talk about our engineers. I'll finish off with 3 engineers because these guys are very important. I really love this guy, Thomas Coltrane Kiefer. I remember hearing about him when I was a kid growing up in Welland, because the Kiefers were a prominent family in building the Welland Canal, which I learned about all the time I was living in Welland. But eventually, Thomas Coltrane Kiefer got a contract to put up some waterworks buildings that are still standing in the Loretton Flats area, but then eventually married into the Mackay family, the Mackay family, depending how you want to pronounce it, who the original residents of Rideau Hall. This was a later home that Mackay had built for his daughter, Elizabeth Kiefer, who Thomas Coltrane Kiefer eventually married, and took over the Mackay family enterprises in New Edinburgh after Robert Mackay died, and Thomas Coltrane Kiefer took over and married first the lady who's standing, Annie Mackay Kiefer, and then when she passed away, then he married the lady who was sitting, which is Annie Kiefer. I'm sorry, I think I got that mixed up. I think Elizabeth Kiefer Elizabeth was his first wife, and then the one who's sitting down, Annie, was his second wife, which is why you see they both have Mackay as their name. A couple more. This one, 2 that are very personal to me. This one's very personal because this is the building I lived in for my 3 years. I was in Ottawa. I just lived in that one room that's to the left of the balcony upstairs, and it belonged to Eugene de la Fleur, who's one of the people that I wanted to investigate because I lived in his home. I don't have a photograph of him, so I showed instead a picture of his father, who was also Eugene Lafleur, who was a civil lawyer in Quebec, whose son conveniently was a civil engineer, who was appointed by Sir Wilfrid Laurier to build a canal that was going to be called the Georgian Bay Ship Canal. And it was a plan to turn the Ottawa River into a navigable canal and then build a canal connecting it to the French River. The whole idea being is that the unified canal would allow navigation companies to avoid going through Lake Ontario, through the Welland Canal, Lake Erie, Lake Huron, and back up. It would have been a wonderful shortcut, but unfortunately, a lot of Laurier's fellow members of Parliament who happened to live in Southern Ontario and relied on the traffic that came through Ontario area, the Welland Canal, they kind of shot down Mr. Lafleur's plans. So this poor man who built the house that I lived in spent 7 years planning the Georgian Bay Ship Canal, and it never passed. Unfortunately, it was turned down. And then second last year, I do want to talk about Mark Patrick Gillen. I don't have much to say about him. He was a lawyer. There's thousands of them in Ottawa. If they aren't in law firms, then they're members of Parliament. But he was noted for at one point purchasing in 1963 the Lord Elgin Hotel and turned it into a luxury hotel. But other than that, I'm going to close off my presentation with this gentleman right here, Hugh John McNulty, who again lived in the same house later after, actually before Mark Patrick Gillen purchased it. It belonged and was built for Hugh John McNulty. Again, just another average everyday lawyer, but I want to talk about his sister. I started out my presentation in Mississauga, where I live, and I'm going to end it off in Mississauga because the building I want to talk about last here is this open parking lot, this house that no longer exists behind that blue car. But I wanted to show the building next to it, which is 234 Lisgar, because there are 4 buildings in a row that all look the same. Were all built at the same time by the same developer, Robert Corey. And if you look at the fire insurance plans, they all look the same. So I'm going to assume that the house that belonged to John McNulty Sr. looked very much like the neighboring buildings. But it was in this house that Mary McNulty was born. And like her older brother, she wanted to be a lawyer. And she went to Osgood College in Toronto, prestigious college. She graduated, the very first woman to graduate from Osgood College, and the first woman to be on the lawyers' debating team. So obviously a very confident woman, someone who would have been a very capable lawyer, because in a very male-dominated culture that was law at this time, particularly with the Law Society of Upper Canada, which managed Osgood Hall, the fact that they actually allowed this woman in and actually invited her to be on the debating team, which they won that year, thanks in part to Mary. So she decided to open up a law firm of her own on Spark Street in the Blackburn building. And unfortunately, she couldn't find clients because she was a woman. The Ottawa Citizen, fascinated by the fact that there was a woman lawyer, the first woman lawyer in Ottawa. I did confirm that. She's also only the 9th woman in all of Canada to pass the bar, and the first in Ottawa. But in a feature in the Ottawa Citizen, they described Miss McNulty as charmingly feminine, and they found her to be a very ladylike lawyer, which I think they were trying to compliment her, but actually just impose stereotypes that women weren't strong enough to be lawyers. So unfortunately, after 3 years, she closed down her law office and found a job with the Canadian Bankers Association in the same building. And she became a legal secretary, which women could do, but they couldn't be lawyers. So kind of frustrating. But I wanted to bring her up, because she's near and dear to me, because she finally got fed up trying to be a lawyer. She found a job with Eaton's as a fashion buyer. So what a switch from law to buying women's fashions. Eaton sent her to Austria in 1930, where she bought fashions that she sent over, the latest fashions from Europe coming over to Eaton's into Toronto and then to their calendar and there across Canada. And she met someone by the name of Alphonse Fix, who was a violinist with the Vienna Symphony Orchestra. And just when the Nazis were not so much invading Austria, but kind of were given permission to take Austria over, Alphonse and Mary decided to move back to Canada, and they found a home in my neighborhood called Port Credit, where she ran a dress shop, which is, again, for her, I think at the time, a step down from being the lawyer that I wish she could have been. But what became important is that in 1952, after her husband died and she was running a dress shop on her own, she got a notice in the mail, January 1st, telling her that her taxes had gone up 300%. She was furious. She was going to take the township of Toronto, which is what Mississauga was called at the time, to court, and decided, no, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to run for office. I'm going to run for the Reeve. I'd never been in council before, but I'm so frustrated. And she heard about people that were frustrated by taxes going up, not enough industries coming in, too many of the residents and the farmers that lived in the area were paying taxes, and she won. With no experience in politics, she was elected 4 times. And so she's the mayor of Toronto Township. At around the same time, Charlotte Whitten is the mayor of Ottawa. Now, Toronto Township wasn't nearly as big as Ottawa at the time, so Charlotte Whitten gets the claim of being the first female lawyer of a major city, because Ottawa was a major city at the time, and Toronto Township wasn't. It is now. And so, yeah, she just became a prominent person. She retired after she lost the 1960 election, and she became very prominent in protecting heritage buildings in Mississauga, and finally helped save the Bradley Museum, which is the museum I worked at in Mississauga for 19 years. So thank you, Mary. Perhaps it's to my benefit that you never did become a lawyer in Ottawa because your city wasn't ready for a female lawyer at the time, but I benefited from it because I had the opportunity to work at the Bradley Museum for 19 years. So I thought I'd end that there. Sorry I had to cut things short. Didn't want to go too long, although I guess I have gone too long, but I thought this was an interesting journey of some of the homes. And if you ever see any homes along the line that you're interested about, get in contact with Ben or anyone at the HSO, and I'm happy to do the research for you. So I'll say thank you for inviting me, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation.
Well, thank you, Richard, for a marvelous presentation. I love how basically you touched on almost every element of Ottawa history and so many tie-ins with speaker series that we've done in the past or in the future. My mind is just spinning with it all. You know, for example, you were talking about Igor Gazenko, and I know that in the story of his rescue from retaliation from the Soviet embassy, a family member of our April speaker, Paul Couvret, was involved with that. I believe his mother, and he can probably shed some light on that. Talking about Burkett Castle and its role with the Boy Scouts, I believe our speaker in February, David Trumner, talked about that, and of course Lillian Bilski Freeman. I love how you really told some great stories of women's history, not just because it's March, but because these are stories that are great to tell. I mean, it's easy to find stories about lumber barons and fathers of Confederation, but there's some amazing women's stories, and certainly no greater than Lillian Bilski Freeman, again related to Anna Bilski, who'll be doing our introduction in April for our story on Jewish history. Lillian Freeman, I believe, was the first Jewish Canadian to receive the Order of the British Empire. Quite remarkable. And she was the type of person who was called upon by governments in difficult times. The reason she became the Poppy Lady was she was called upon by Mackenzie King to do this. During 1918, during the flu epidemic, she was called upon to organize women to provide the resources, masks and all that sort of stuff that we usually count on public health today. So some great stories there. I love your story about the Fleck Patterson House and Andrew Fleck and Gertrude Flood. One of my favorite stories, and I'm a big fan of Algonquin Park. I love to hike Algonquin Park. And those of us who love Algonquin Park, one of our favorite trails is the Booth's Rock Trail. And there's a tangent on the Booth's Rock Trail by Rock Lake. I believe it's called the Barclay Estate right now. But originally it was the estate that belonged to Andrew Fleck and Gertrude Booth Fleck. And of course, he ran the railroad for his father-in-law, J.R. Booth, whose railways were the largest private railways in the world at one point. So because they had this railway through Algonquin Park, it was very handy. They had a cottage lot there right on the beautiful peninsula on Rock Lake. And what they would do every year was they would actually park a dining car on a siding on their cottage in Algonquin Park. And because Gertrude Booth Fleck loved this dining car that much, Richard, when you did that tour of the Algerian embassy and you saw the dining room in the Fleck Patterson house, it was built to look like that railway car. So lots of great stories out there. I'm going to paraphrase one of your listeners tonight, Sylvia G., who says, I have walked or driven by many of these houses you showed us, but never really stopped and marveled at them. Thank you for telling us so much about them. I very much enjoyed your talk. It is great to know this next time I stop when walking by. So I think what Sylvia has to say we can all occur with.
Yeah, that's my goal, is to get people to realize and appreciate some of these lovely buildings.
Marcia Kay says, agreed, we need a part 2. My family has so many connections here. My brain is starting to explode, just like you hear me exploding with stories that I want to add to what you're saying. Bill J says, it would be great to be able to look at these at our leisure later. Now, of course, this presentation is being recorded, Richard. Within a week or so, it'll be on our website. People can view it again. But possibly you could put something together as well as an attachment, perhaps a PowerPoint that people can access. We can put on our website as well, if that's okay with you.
I can do that. I'll have to add some text to it, but yeah, I'd be happy to take some.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic. Or maybe even tie it in with the next newsletter. Yeah. So lots of great comments coming through. Brian Cook, I wonder if I could get you to unmute yourself. You have a good question for Richard?
Well, I think I am unmuted. Can you hear me?
I can
sure can, Brian.
Oh, well, first of all, Richard, absolutely splendid. Lots of sort of research over all sorts of different areas and people. It was a great tour. And I do hope you maybe can come forward and do part 2 of the tour, because I noticed a number of people said we'd like to spend more time with the engineers and the doctors and others. Yeah. So please come back, Richard.
Thank you. Yeah, it's already done, so I'm happy to do it.
Yeah, my question was, and I believe it's the same house you showed us, the Fleck house on Wilbrod.
Yeah, I'll go right back because I think that's right at the start. You would pick one that's right at the start.
Well, that house, I believe, is the house which originally was owned. I don't know who had owned it, but I think it was a Booth house originally.
Yeah, it was. This house was built actually by J.R. Booth for his daughter, but his daughter married Fleck. So the Flecks were to live in it, but it was built as a gift to Ellen, or yeah, Ellen Booth.
Well, I once rented this house, and for a retreat for my senior management, and it was at the time the place where the Institute of Flying Yogics held out, which is kind of weird. None of my management actually managed to elevate, but nevertheless, it was the Institute of Flying Yogics.
They were the whirling dervishes, weren't they? I think, yeah, the national, I can't remember the name of the party, and he might remember, what was the magician's name?
I forget. Yes, you know the magician, yeah. In any case, the distinctive features in this house, which I found, were one, the place that looks, the long dining room that looks like the inside of a club car, of a railway car. And I was told that that was where, in fact, the federal cabinet would go and meet when they wanted to be out of sight, out of mind. And
it might have been during Patterson's term, because he was a senator, so it's possible.
Yeah, Patterson hosted them as that. It had a garage which had a turntable in it because they owned the first Rolls Royce, and it didn't have a reverse gear, so they drove in and turned it around. And I understand also from the back of that house was the railway that Booth ran out to Algonquin. And there was, and that was located out the back of that house. So, and that railway actually, I think, ran around behind where now the Russian embassy is. So it's an absolutely splendid house inside, and I recommend people to come and see it.
Yeah, I love
Thank you very much, Richard.
I love hearing stories like this. Thanks, Brian, because when I do walking tours, you get these kind of exchanges. I didn't know about that turntable in the garage. That's a great story.
Yeah.
Thanks,
I think that Rotary thing now has been converted into a theater in the round.
Ah,
yeah.
I know that's where the RCMP, according to Francois, that's where the RCMP were listening in on the Russians next door.
Okay.
They were allies, but just barely.
Well, but thank you very much.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you, Brian. And you know, another fact about that garage is it originally was built as a coach house, of course, as many were back in those days. We have a comment here from Diana Lester. Now, I had mentioned our pamphlets on Richard Lester earlier, and Diana Lester is one of Richard Lester's descendants who helped us out with those pamphlets. And Diane's comment is, would have loved to see the doctors. We need a part 2 of this presentation. We have a whole bunch of people telling us that we need to have a part 2 of this presentation, Richard. Somebody's also requested a list of the addresses. I think what you have to do, Richard, is you have to move back to Ottawa and start doing walking tours.
I'm debating it now.
And it's fascinating.
But unfortunately, my French wasn't that good. I couldn't get work with museums. I miss Ottawa so much. I really do. It's beautiful architecture. And
it's fascinating. There's so many addresses in Sandy Hill, but also in Centretown and in Rockcliffe and in the West End as well. So the whole city is rooted in this history, isn't it?
Yeah, I would say when I was there for 3 years, I wasn't working because I was helping to care for my mom. And in my spare time, I got to admit, for 3 years, that's why I just cataloged about 3,000 properties.
Yeah,
because what I love to do. So yeah, and Ottawa just has, and not just buildings, parks, just other historic sites. It's a great city, and I hope people appreciate what they've got, because Toronto's not so bad, but the suburbs around Toronto are notorious for tearing down buildings just so developers can put something new up. So yeah, if you can get involved with saving these great old buildings, because Ottawa's got a lot of them.
Now, Richard, I have to say, in the half decade or so that I've been running our Facebook page, the two most contentious issues, the two issues that raise passionate feelings on both sides of the debate. One is the renaming of streets, and we're not going to get into that. But the other topic is 24 Sussex Drive. So, Richard, right on this spot, you were going to solve the big national question, Richard. What should be done with 24 Sussex Drive?
Well, it's I mean, it's an historic building simply because it's been the residence of prime ministers for not as long as it's been for some lumber merchants, but it is an historic building. I know people say, well, why put good money after bad? But I don't think whatever condition the building is in. I've seen a lot of historic buildings restored that were in worse shape, I'm sure, than what 24 Sussex Drive is in. I don't know all the details. But certainly it's such an important part of our history. If no one wants to live in it, turn it into a museum. And
very diplomatic answer, Rich. Very diplomatic. Well, I thank you very much for tonight's presentation. As you can see, everybody wants to hear more. So maybe we can put together some information for the newsletter or for our website, and perhaps Sherry can invite you back for a part 2 as well. So I invite everybody to join us at the auditorium on March 23rd when James Powell presents Ottawa's Women on Ice. Come back on Zoom to us on Wednesday, April 10th, when David C. Martin will present Paupers, Peddlers, Purveyors, and Parishioners, the First Golden Age of Jewish Life in Ottawa. And our final speaker series presentation of the spring will be at the auditorium on April 27th, The Karsh Brothers with Paul Kubrick. Thank you very much to everyone. Thank you very much to Karen Lynn, to Sherry, to Richard, and thank you all for joining us tonight.
Thank you. Yeah. I'm gonna take that right down now.